Well, an elderly couple were sitting down together and the lady said, "I remember when you kissed me whenever you could." Well, the old man leant over and pecked her on the cheek. She also said, "I remember when you used to hold my hand all the time." And the old man just moved his hand over and grabbed her on the hand as well. But she continued, "I remember when you used to nibble on my neck." And well, the old man just shuffled out of the room and she said, "Where are you going?" And he said, "To find my teeth." Because one of the riches of marriage is being able to spend life together, to do life together, growing together, sharing together, loving one another, investing in one another over many, many years. In Psalm chapter 11 and verse 3, the psalmist says, "If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?" The foundations of society rest on marriage and the family. And if the foundations are destroyed, society will collapse into chaos. And this is the very thing that we are seeing in many homes today. As someone who is familiar with building and building practices and also familiar with foundations, there's one thing I can say to you for certain. If you do not have a foundation, do not even think about the rest of the building. Without a foundation, any house that is built will fall down within the year. Doesn't matter how structurally secure every other part of the house is. That's above the foundations. It doesn't matter how nice your kitchen looks. Doesn't even matter how well the paintwork matches. Everything that has been done will have been done for naught. There's a very good saying, and it's this: a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. If the foundations give way, so does the rest of the house. Now, I have seen houses that have collapsed within themselves, expensive houses, all because the foundations gave way. On the Gold Coast, a property developer drained a swamp in the 70s to create a canal development. But he decided to bulldoze the trees over and to bury them rather than remove them. He took the cheaper option. What do you think happens when trees begin to rot away? What do you think happens? Well, you guessed it. They leave voids. And down came the houses that were built above it, into the pockets of air that were left after the trees had rotted out. Foundations are important. And the psalmist here is alarmed at the attacks of the wicked against himself, and the people of God, against their good character, against their righteous living. He despairs over the loss of what is probably the law of the Lord, that there's such a wholesale revolt against that. That the city is full of unrighteous people who have no regard for the standards of the Lord. And when the majority, of course, have no regard for the Lord's standards, then look out. Chaos is going to reign. And so the lament then from the psalmist is this: if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? But his one consolation in that psalm is this: that he takes refuge in the Lord. The Lord is his secure place. And he says, the Lord loves righteousness, and the righteous run to him. Now, we in Australia are under threat from the unrighteous as they attempt to destroy the foundations of marriage and the family. Of course, they believe they're just broadening the category of marriage to include same-sex and transgender couples. But instead of broadening it, they will, in fact, destroy it. I must confess, however, that Penny Wong, who herself is a homosexual, is correct on her point that much of marriage has already been ruined by heterosexuals. Most prominently with the change of the Marriage Act in 1975. Australians then could, for the first time, receive a divorce on the basis of the irretrievable breakdown of the marriage, with a no-fault clause attributed. Most unusual is this change, or to this change, is that a contractual covenant has no penalty clauses or no fault if someone breaks it. Now, as with government laws or contracts, there is always provision for penalties against the one who does not fulfil the obligations of that contract or that covenant. After all, what would be the point of any law in the land if there were no penalties for breaking them? Oh, forgot to pay my tax for the last 10 years. Oh, no worries, no penalty. I got caught doing 100 kilometres an hour down Ogilvie Avenue. Oh, don't worry about it, no penalties. I held up the 7-Eleven store at Knife Point. Don't worry about it, no penalties. Oh, the builder has been paid for the new house that I've wanted, but it's been 5 years and he still hasn't finished the house. Oh, no worries, no penalty. We all know that if there are no penalties, people just put themselves first. They just do what they want to do. They will get away with what they can. That's, we might say, humanity, but it's, of course, sinful humanity. And we would then, if that was the case, have to change the word laws to the word suggestions. Laws would only be suggestions if they did not have any penalties. Now, in 1975, the whole idea of changing the Marriage Act was to remove the financial burden of getting a divorce and to give relief from the burden of a bad marriage. Now, the thinking today is the same, so-called safe injection rooms or the legalisation of brothels. What we need to understand as Christians is that when it comes to sin, there can be no upside for anyone if the sin is encouraged. There is never an upside. And if there is no deterrent, then sin will escalate. I know for a fact that in Victoria, illegal brothels are out of control. Even though they've legalised prostitution, illegal brothels are exponentially greater than before they changed the law to allow for legal brothels. See, we need to understand that sin is like a virus. It spreads, and legalising it only makes matters worse. So it has been also with divorce. They wanted to free people from a bad marriage, but by making it easy to get out of, they have created further untold damage to the point where the latter solution is actually worse than the former problem. Here we have some percentages which relate to the number of divorces compared with the number of marriages. In the 1950s, divorce ran at a rate of 10% of marriages. Now, when the Family Act came in the 70s, 1975, that comparison jumped to 43%. Now, today, it's a little over 50% of all marriages end in divorce. The easy opt-out option has not helped preserve marriages. Now, I'm not passing judgment on people who have experienced divorce. After all, I'm a product of a broken home. I still love my parents. I don't judge them or condemn them. But being a product of a broken home, I can well attest to the devastation and the insecurities a divorce brings upon children. What you also need to realise, however, is that there are many couples who now live together in a de facto arrangement, and their separation rate is even greater than that of marriage. In other words, their percentage of couples who get together and live together, the percentage is greater than marriage of those who then separate. John Stott argues that the greatest single reason for the increase of the divorce rate in our time is this. He says, quote, "The decline of the Christian faith in the West, together with the loss of commitment to a Christian understanding of the sanctity and permanence of marriage, and the growing non-Christian assault on traditional concepts of sex, marriage, and family." We've witnessed many revolutions of the past. There's been the French Revolution, the American Revolution, Marxist revolutions in China, Russia, for example. The single most devastating revolution to affect marriage has been the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s. The sex, drugs and rock and roll era. Slogans there that said it all. Make love, not war. But what made this all so easy was in fact the invention of the contraceptive pill. A woman could take this pill and be free to engage in sexual activity with no pregnancy consequences. It liberated women, but brought in a ton load of sexual promiscuity. And yes, men were equally to blame. It was this onslaught that pressured the federal government to lessen the strictures around marriage laws and make divorce an easy option. It has got to the point now that the government has removed all discrimination against those who do not even wish to marry but live in a de facto relationship. So let's understand this fully. There is now no legal difference between living together unmarried and living together as married. It's like we have laws without penalties. Actually, marriage now is more like a suggestion. It's a suggestion. But I want you to note the nonsense that has now been created. In the Marriage Act, there are very grave consequences for marriage celebrants who do not conduct a wedding according to the Marriage Act. If they have omitted, say, the wedding vows, or the vows have not been explicit, then you can serve jail time. That's right. I could serve jail time if I do not make sure the wedding is carried out right to the letter. I kid you not. You have to say very specific things in the vows. If you have not identified the couple earlier in the wedding ceremony, the vows have to be explicit. You know, I, David McCallum, not Davey or Dave. Take you, Rosalind, not Tuppy Jean, is a little nickname I used to call her from way back there in the first year of our marriage. Sorry, honey, I'm going to be killed later, I know that. I take thee, Rosalind, June McCallum, or Watchridge, it was at the time, as my lawful wedded wife. I had to say that exactly like that. It has to do with legally identifying the couple so that there can be no doubt or question as to the legal standing of that marriage. Now, this is only one aspect of many, many, many other laws surrounding the marriage ceremony. But why on earth do you need all this when you can just live together as a de facto couple with all the rights, all the privileges of a married couple? To me, it smacks of hypocrisy. Nonsense. I attend one day a year ongoing professional development to retain my marriage celebrant's licence. And I have raised several times with the lecturers this blatant hypocrisy of actually risking jail time when this same couple could just live together and the government would recognise their relationship and grant them every right that a married couple has. They can see it all right. They know it. But of course, there's nothing they can do about it. So the reality is, heterosexuals have all but made marriage irrelevant. And now they want to further decimate marriage by making it genderless, by allowing same-sex, transgender and transgenderless couples to marry. What is behind it all? Postmodernism is a philosophy that is current in our day. It permeates the universities and the mainstream media. Most people have heard of it, but they could not define what it is to anyone else. I don't blame them for that, because it is the most incoherent and most illogical philosophy that we've had to date. Let me try to explain it to you in 2 minutes. You and me, as Christians, work from the big picture, God. We believe that God is over all and that His truth applies to every living soul on planet Earth, since, of course, He is the creator of all. Philosophically, this is called the grand narrative or the grand story. Christians have no problem with this at all, and it fits perfectly with our experience of the world. However, a postmodern person rejects the grand story or the grand narrative. They only believe in local narratives or micro-narratives. Now, this was brought out very clearly by Greg Kokel when he visited a university. And he posed a question there to the students. He wrote on a blackboard, he said this: "It is always, always, always wrong to torture babies for fun." What do you think? Now, such question to a person who accepts this grand story or grand narrative would immediately say, of course, that is wicked and vile to torture babies just for fun, no matter where you live in the world. But these students, indoctrinated in postmodern philosophy, were choking on that statement. They were thinking of local or micro-narratives and trying to think perhaps, there's a culture or a small people group somewhere in the world that might actually torture babies for fun. And if there is such a group, then it must be okay because that's their truth. Who are we to impose our views upon them? But of course, the human side of these students was in a serious conflict because they know intuitively that it is always, always, always wrong to torture babies for fun. So the problem we now face in the Western world is that truth is now in the eye of the beholder. No grand or overarching truth, just micro stories. This idea has become the source for elevating minority groups. Affirmative action is the tool that's used to elevate these minority groups, even if it infringes upon the will or rights of the majority. So when it comes to getting a job, an ethnic person or a woman might be given more points towards getting the job than, say, a straight, white, Aussie male. My cousin's husband is of Italian descent. I know for a fact that he was given more points towards his job application for the fire brigade than anyone else. And he did go to get that job. So we can see where this stuff is all coming from. Now we have the push to allow same-sex marriage. A minority group of people, less than 2% of the population, and many of these that don't want marriage. Yet you have those in the same-sex marriage camp who are just falling over themselves to get the Marriage Act changed. And many of these are not even homosexual people, but they are so intoxicated by this philosophy that they know no different. So intense are they that they will target individuals, businesses, companies. In fact, they will seek to punish anyone who does not support their agenda. But for Christians, the grand narrative is true. And we must do all we can to protect marriage for the benefit of the present and of future generations. This couple were having a dinner together at a fancy restaurant. And as the food was served, the husband said, "Wow, this food looks delicious. Let's eat." His wife says, "Honey, you always say a prayer at home before we eat." And the husband said, "Well, that's at home, sweetheart. Here, the chef knows how to cook." Ooh, cheeky, or what? Oh, we can have a bit of banter. We know that's not true. Marriage is God's design for the human race. In fact, marriage is tied to who we are as male and female. Marriage is the joining of biological opposites. God, by design, has made us this way. God formed Adam from the dust or clay of the ground, tying him to the creation, tying us to the material world. In Genesis 2, we see that the woman was not made or created from new and separate material. God didn't go and create her separately in the same way that he created Adam. But he created her from the material of the man. She was created using one of Adam's ribs. She was made from him. Now, this is no insignificant statement. This is very important. This is axiomatic in understanding this relationship between husband and wife. In creating the woman from the man, God is showing that marriage is about the union of these opposites. God takes a rib from Adam and gives it back to him as a woman. The two are joined together and are said to be one flesh. So the union of a man and his wife becomes the basis for the whole human family and the basis for every marriage union after that. As Jesus says in Matthew 19, "So they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." So each marriage, like the very first one between Adam and Eve, has been brought together by God. One of the reasons I stand against some of these radically inclusive Bible translations is that they fail to bring out these distinctions of man as male and female. Now, they might use the plural word, human beings instead. But theologically, there's a problem. The plural fails to express the singular word man. And thus, Adam is not seen as the specific representation of all of mankind. Let's have a look at some verses here. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. The man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman," or womb man, man with a womb, "because she was taken out of man." In other words, she's called Isha because she was taken out of Ish, which is the basis for why a woman takes her husband's name. Ish is Adam, Isha, Eve. So behind, one more, Genesis 5 verse 2. He created the male and female, he blessed them and named them man in the day that they were created. Behind the underlined words there, man, is the Hebrew word for Adam. It is literally Adam. Adam is there translated as man, which is interesting and I think significant, that the person of Adam becomes the head of all mankind or all Adamkind. But also that Eve finds herself attached to him. Now, why is this so important? It's important because the woman is seen as an extension or counterpart of her husband, and together they become a single entity. Now, I know for some, they do not like the connotation of a male headship or a male prominence, but they're missing some very important things here. Something very important, that the man and the woman become one flesh. Singular. The unity, even though a diversity, that of male and female, becomes a beautiful complementary relationship. Not one meant to be a competition, but of complement according to the sex, either of male, female. And that is the way God has meant us to be. So instead of the woman having a separate identity and existence of her own, an independence from the man, from a husband, as we find in so many relationships out there, the scriptures point to an even greater bond, that the two become one flesh. Now, a number of people have contended that Jesus never spoke against homosexuality. Now, when the woman was caught in the act of adultery, Jesus did not condemn her. So why, some would say, would he condemn a homosexual and their relationship? Well, it all sounds so convincing until you think about it a little harder. Firstly, after Jesus stood up for the woman caught in the act of adultery and refused to stone her dead, he nevertheless told her to leave her life of sin. So Jesus affirmed the person, but not her sin. He forgave her, but he insisted she change her lifestyle. Now, if she doesn't, she will find a different greeting on the day of judgment. See, we live in a day of grace, and the blessings of forgiveness from God is freely available to us now. But that will not be open forever. People don't seem to understand that, but they do need to understand it. Grace is available now, so you should take it with two hands, two arms, because that will not be the case always. There are people who believe that because Jesus never expressly condemned homosexuality, that he would approve of it today. But you know, Jesus never spoke about rape or incest. Do we, by the same logic, say that Jesus would now approve of incest or rape? But the biggest fact that remains is that there were no, at least visible, homosexuals in Israel. I mean, if the Jews were so quick to stone a woman caught in the act of adultery, how much quicker do you think that the stones would come out for a homosexual in that time? You see, in the law of Moses, there were not many things called an abomination. But homosexuality is called this in Leviticus 18. You shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination. Furthermore, there in the law of Moses, we find what God thinks about transgender practices. Deuteronomy 22. A woman shall not wear man's clothing, nor shall a man put on woman's clothing. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. So there is no way that a homosexual would be present in Israel at the time of Jesus. And that is why he never spoke about the issue. There was no need to speak on that issue. On the other hand, he did speak approvingly of the permanence of marriage between a man and a woman. Now we can go to the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul gets so taken by the truth of Genesis 2, that the two become one flesh, that the Apostle refers to the church, us, as the bride of Christ. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved his bride, the church, and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendour, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, hold fast or cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Beautiful picture of the union of Christ with his people. And it's based on the marriage concept of the two becoming one flesh. That we, his people, are one with the Lord. Beautiful concept. Now we come to the argument that the same-sex marriage camp has. The argument they really put forward is this, and you've probably seen it around on the internet and on the news. Love is love. Well, if we use this as the basis for this argument, then I guess that would include polygamy, having more than one wife. Plenty of men have loved more than one woman at the same time. It is the Muslim way, and it is the way of the Mormon, although they are not permitted to at the present time in the US. But of course, if love is love, then we should allow polygamy, many wives, or polyandry, many husbands. Should a mother marry her son? A father his daughter? A brother his sister? Don't laugh. There are people who are after this as well. They're wanting it because they are saying the same. Well, love is love. So if love is love, why not all these others? But the correct way to refute this is to see that marriage is not based on love per se. Yes, we may love someone and wish to marry them, but that should not be the sole basis for the marriage. Often we find that the love that brings a couple together is actually not the love that keeps them together. Wouldn't you be concerned about the person's character? Wouldn't you want to select a spouse that you see as honourable? Because many people have fallen in love with an undesirable and they have ended up in divorce. There has to be more to marriage than just love. In fact, the only reason governments have got involved in marriage in the first place is not so that they can be a matchmaking service, but to protect the vulnerable in our society, and that is children. You see, it's not in the government's interest to have bad families or families that have broken down. Strong, secure, stable homes with biological mum and dad is the best way to raise healthy, well-adjusted and secure children. And these children go on to become less of a burden to society, to governments, because they are well adjusted. Hence the reason the government gets involved in the first place. Andrew Hastie the federal member for Canning, has written this: redefining marriage will make it weaker. And where we have fewer marital unions and increased breakdowns, we are likely to see an increase in the size and scale of the welfare state to care for broken families. Now, of course, this is not to say that single parents or even same-sex parents don't make good parents. I'm not saying that. The point is, the best environment for the raising of children is where they are brought up by their biological mum and dad. And that is God's way and what His people should uphold. And of course, to say that like it's none of our business because we just live in a secular society is actually to deny the grand narrative that God is creator of all. It's His world. And so we should be concerned about His world. As His people, we have a responsibility to uphold God's word, uphold God's design for marriage. I think never before has the institution of marriage come so close to the precipice of its own demise. It is seriously in trouble. And children are going to be the losers here. You see, the sexual revolution has created homes designed to fall apart. Now, some good-intentioned people get caught up in this. And if you think that this sermon is a judgment upon you, you would be wrong. This is about separating ourselves from the issues and seeing the good in God's design and standing up for it and even fighting for it. So may our marriages be salt and light to a world that desperately needs Christ.